turn to two chapter 11s. We're going to look at John chapter 11. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 11. Today. As you turn there, just lend me your ear. I want to ask you a couple questions. Just think about them. You don't have to just shout out your answer, but what defines God in your life? What is the essence of your faith? We're all different people from different walks of life, grew up differently, different hometowns, maybe different priorities. Every one of us is unique. God made it that way. It's beautiful and it's great. Sometimes we find each other and we find, people that we would say, oh, we're so much alike, and you love each other like crazy and you hate each other like crazy because you're so much alike. Other times we find people that we're not alike and we enjoy it because it brings something to our life that maybe we don't have. A lot of times they say, even in romantic love, opposites attract. Because there's something that you see in the other person that's almost unique, or you're not sure how it's defined. It's the mystery side of love. And God has made each and every one of us unique, and it's a beautiful thing. Within that, we also come to God in many different ways. We come to Him maybe from places of great need and desperation. You know how you came to the Lord. You know how you came to an understanding of the saving grace that God gives. And for some, it was in desperation. For others, it was an explanation. Maybe there was all kinds of it all around you. And somebody explained it to you one day and you got it. Or you received what it was that God wanted for your life. For others, it was maybe a very lonely time. A cry of desperation that came when there was nobody around. Nobody to explain, but yet God showed up. Every one of our stories are unique, and they're beautiful because they got us to our connection point with salvation. They connected us with a life in eternity. No person's story is more grandiose than the other because you know what? The result is what marks the story's beauty. The result is what makes the stories magnificent. And so some, you hear the testimonies and they're, oh, wish I had a testimony like that. They were, raised without parents with wolves, in the bush, and they came out and emerged and then got addicted on all kinds of things and then levitated to a new place in their faith and then a plane hit them as they were, and you get these grandiose stories of how people came and we think, oh, how can I ever, measure up to that testimony? But it's not about that part, because all of that leads up to the great moment. Right? All of those things lead up to the saving moment. You watch any movie and they call it the pinnacle of the movie or the climactic moment of the movie is when the hero comes in and saves. That's the mark of a good moment in a superhero movie. But that's what God did for us. It doesn't matter where you've come from, what your situation, how you met the Lord, how you've walked through life. Maybe you have not found that Savior yet. It doesn't matter your story or your background, whether it was great or bad or it wasn't that bad, I'm not that. It doesn't matter. None of that really matters. What matters is that salvation point where you come to an understanding of who God is, who He really is, not who you thought He was, but who He really is, and that seals the deal for you, and you walk into this newfound life that God offers for you. Because it's really about what Jesus did. But no matter how you got to that point, or no matter what is leading you to that point, the question still remains, how do you define God? What is it that you use as the metric that helps you understand who God is to you. In Hebrews chapter 11, there's this amazing list of individuals. I mean, the title of the chapter in the NIV is just by faith. And it starts like this. It says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That's a complicated statement in and of itself. Faith is being sure of what we hope for. Otherwise, you know what? It's not faith. Faith. And certain of what we do not see. Last week, we talked about having ears to hear and eyes to see. Not just having ears and eyes, not just the awareness, although awareness is important in transition, in transformation. It is a very important part. But it's not good enough to just be aware. We must act. We actually have to walk it out. We actually have to have a part in the process. And that's what it talks about in the scriptures when it says, have eyes to see and ears to hear. In other words, yes, see it, but respond to it. Hear it, now do something about it. Faith is being certain of what we do not see. And then it goes through and it says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And then it goes through individuals, right back from Abel and Enoch in verse 5. In 7, by faith Noah, when warned about the things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. In verse 11 again, by faith Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. It says in verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 11, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. Interesting. These people that we see as, just giants. Every one of them lived by faith, but they still died in the middle of their faith. If we're going to have eyes to see and ears to hear, it's not really about necessarily seeing the things that are in front of us, or even audibly always hearing the clear, definitive word of God. Sometimes, and most often I'm going to say, it comes down to faith. We will receive a nudge. There will be an inclination. There will be a stirring in our spirit. There will be a call to something. Maybe there is directive, but we may never get to see what we were living for. We may never get to see what we were believing for. We have to be careful that we do not define our God by our circumstances. We have to be careful that we do not allow God to be defined by our circumstances. I know for me, I love when I hear something, I understand what I need to do, and I get to walk through it and get to the end and I see the result. God, you're so good. I heard it, we did it, and we saw the result. Oh, God, you're so good. Isn't God good? And yes, he is. But what if we get the call and we spend our lives, day in and day out, moving towards what it was, the call was that God had placed on our life, and we don't get to see it? All we see are the trials and tribulations and difficulties along the way. We quit too early. Sometimes we quit too early. This mustn't have been God's call for my life. All I'm doing is just facing constant adversity. Everything is always against me. It's not working. Clearly, I probably heard wrong. And we give up. And really what we do is we stop seeing with our eyes and we stop hearing. Because our circumstances have now defined who God is in our life. There is a weight of responsibility on us to be paying attention. Not just at the moment when we're praying and asking for the direction, but all the way through the process. All the way through the process. And even into our death, or the death of something, still we believe what God called us to do. But it takes a constant wanting to know, an awareness, a constant state of dependency and desperation for God in our life. You know, we sing about the way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper. That is who you are. Those declarations, we need to say them in the middle of the adversity, in the middle of the most difficult parts of our trial. Because what we need to do is not allow our circumstances to define God, but we need to allow God to define our circumstances. In the middle of the things that we're in, and we feel like we're desperate and we're lost and we have nothing, we go to Him and say, well, what do you say about this, God? What is it that you're saying in this moment? Because am I missing it? Did I get it wrong? Because I felt like you said, and then allow Him to show you again. And allow Him to speak to you again. So that your eyes and your ears are ready to hear and to see Him again. Don't quit. Don't exit on the next exit and just say, oof, this is too hard. It mustn't be God. Listen, that saying, I said it a number of weeks ago, somebody corrected a very poor theological thought that often enters within the church. And it said, you know, God will never give you more than you can handle. Garbage, right? Garbage. If you find yourself in the middle of something you feel God called you to do and it's too hard for you, good. Now give it to Him because it was His in the beginning. Do you have a part to play? Yes. But God will never give you something more than He can handle. That is the truth. That is the truth. But it's going to take the faith. It's going to take the faith to receive the call, to actually hear what it is that God had said today, what He has shown you, what He has revealed to you, and then it's going to be to walk with it. Walk with it until the end. All of these people, in verse 13 again, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. Even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I can't feel it, you're working. Comes out so smooth in a song. Feels so good. The drums start building up and there's an anticipation, right? Music is just art. That's how I see it. You bring it up to a place, and you can have people who don't even believe it singing it from the top of their, lungs, just, and yet they don't really believe it in their heart. And there are still things in my life where I have to examine and say, do I really believe that? Because I feel like I'm at the end of myself. I feel like I'm at the end of the rope, and if I were to be super honest, I would actually feel like I need to say, where are you, God? I was listening to a gentleman speak, and he was saying that one day he would love to take an album and make a worship album out of all the songs that we sing and turn them into honest cries. Not just declarative ones, and they are good. We need to speak things as though they are not, as we prophesy into our situations and our difficulties and those. But what if it was, and this is the one he used, he says, you're never gonna let me down. Except for that one time, you're never gonna. And I thought, you know what, that's true. There's so many times we say those things, but yet in our heart we're struggling with something. We're feeling like, God, why aren't you showing up? God, it's been years, and I'm asking you all the time. And apparently what I'm going through is not a part of your nature or your will for my life. But where are you? And in those moments, we have an opportunity to decide whether God will define our circumstances or whether our circumstances will define God. And we can take the next exit if we like, or we can stay the course. Because we believe what he told us in the beginning. If God has said something to you, and he hasn't told you something different, stick with what it was that he told you. Until he tells you something different. Stay the course. Even if it means that you're still living by faith when you die. Go to John chapter 11. John chapter 11, I spoke from a while back when I was asking the question, what did God say? Because there are times in our life, and it relates very closely to what we're talking about today, where we'll face difficulties, and we'll go through things, and we will allow ourselves to decide what it is that's going on in a situation. But the question is, what did God say? What did God say, and am I going to stay the course? And we look at John chapter 11, and we see the story of Lazarus. Martha and Mary. And it's an incredible story where a circumstance, a situation was so dire. People were so desperate that they actually sent a servant to go and find Jesus. Obviously they knew, where he was to a degree. And he didn't have text or GPS on his phone. It's like, if I want to know how close my wife is to getting home from the grocery store, I just pull her up on my phone and say, oh, yeah, she's driving up barefoot. We're good. And those are great conveniences. They didn't have that. But they knew, obviously, roughly where Jesus was. Because Mary and Martha sent somebody. Because Lazarus, their brother, is super sick. Like, not just like he's sick and he's like, hey, Jesus, probably do a little party trick and make this runny nose go away. He's like on the verge of death. They knew who Jesus was. They were friends with Jesus. And so they send a servant off. The servant arrives and desperately says to Jesus this. Lord, the one you love is sick. This is in verse 3. Verse 4. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory. So that God's Son may be glorified through it. So that's what Jesus said. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Weird 2 verses to go together. Desperate, send somebody, come and heal Lazarus. He's super sick. He makes a statement. This is going to be for God's glory. Will not end in death. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. He loved them. It's like it reaffirms there. John, he reaffirms the fact that Jesus loved them, and he stays longer. And then he says, let's go back to Judea. Sometimes in the middle of the difficult situations that we're in, we can almost begin to question. Question God's love, question God's power, question whether or not there's something maybe going on in our life. We bring all kinds of questions to the table when the circumstances of our life don't seem to measure up with what we would expect would be good. And this is where the diversity of our uniqueness as individuals comes into play within this faith struggle, if you like, this believing things that we cannot see kind of struggle. Because now my perception of God may pass through the filter of all the things that have gone on in my life. So when God doesn't seem to show up, and I'm ready for him to show up, I'm super desperate for him to show up. Like, he could have come yesterday. I mean, he knows all things. Why did I even have to ask? These things come into our life. Why did this event? It sounds crazy. We say, well, of course we need to ask. It says, everything by prayer and petition, we'll present your... And we would hardly ever dare say, well, God knows all these things. Why do I have to ask? But we do it all the time, because we ask questions like this. Why did this have to happen? Why did that event have to happen? What are we confessing? God, why didn't you show up? Why didn't you show up then? And suddenly our circumstances, we have to navigate these things, but they're going through the resources that we have. How do I process this? Is it because he doesn't love me? Is it because he really doesn't care for Lazarus, that he didn't come? Is it because he wasn't as high a priority? He doesn't care about my feelings. He didn't care that. What about all the support that we've given him? I mean, Mary and Martha were known well to be ones that were big supporters of the ministry that they were doing. He obviously didn't care about anything. How could he have done the things without? And we start to process through, and our circumstances stir all of these things that are within us. We have to get to a place where we decide that, okay, wait a minute. Is he still the God of this circumstance? Or did this circumstance trump him in this one? But it says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. We're not going to get into the other part, what Jesus was doing there, but you got to picture the disciples in this moment. They're like, Jesus, we can't go back there. They're probably going to kill you. And then he begins to speak to them in these words and explains things. And I feel like they're just looking at him like, I don't know what you're saying. And then Jesus looks and sees the empty stare in their eyes and says, Lazarus fell asleep. We're going to go back and wake him up. And they're still like, I don't get it. Because this is what they say next. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus. Listen, he's dead. And we're going to go back and we're going to raise him to life. Okay, just focus on me. Focus on me. Remember who I am. Remember what we're doing here. We're bringing life to those who are dead. We're freeing the captives. He's fallen asleep, meaning like, okay, he's died, but he's going to come back to life. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Speaking of Jesus. So again, these disciples in the middle of this situation, they're forgetting who God is in their circumstance. Not only is this story about Lazarus and Martha and Mary, this is also about bringing revelation to the disciples, the ones who would carry the gospel into all nations after. They still don't get it. I don't know all of the degrees that Jesus was mentioning that this was going to be for the honor or for the glory of God. Obviously, we still read these words today, thousands of years later, and they impact us. But he's also dealing with the ones who are closest to him, who he is going to send out and to release into ministry. And he says, you guys are still not getting it. You're still not getting it. Because all they can think of was, hey, remember that circumstance that happened the last time we were there? And they were going to kill you? In their mind, they're thinking, we ran away. We ran away. We left because we were afraid. Jesus is like, I'm not afraid. This is not about fear. This is about obeying what it is that God calls us to do. Well, we can't go back there because the last time, obviously this time they're going to, Jesus, we're going. God's going to be honored and glorified. Jesus even knew into taking him right into the tomb, God was still going to be honored and glorified. You see, his perspective was different. He was looking for the honor and glory of God. He wasn't necessarily just looking for quick little simple solutions in his circumstances in life. His entire existence was to bring honor and glory to God. So he wasn't stuck in the circumstantial mode. He was looking at the end goal. When we face situations in our life, do we look at them with that perspective, with an eternal perspective that says, yes, this is difficult right now, but how is God going to get the honor and glory in this? This may not be alleviated in 24 hours. This might not be alleviated in 24 days or 24 months. I don't understand my circumstance, but I do know that God understands my circumstance. I can't measure the length of time that it will take from this point here to the point of my salvation in this. I can't measure it, but I can stand here right now and measure the goodness of God in my life. I can stand right here, right now, and think about everything that God has ever done. All his promises have been yes and amen. If you can stand there and think of anything where God has officially let you down, think through your situations right now. Is your story over? Have you reached the end of the book? Have you got to the point where there is nothing left for you to do in those circumstances or situations? And boy, it's tough. It's tough when you consider maybe people have lost loved ones. And it seems like that story is over. That loved one is not struggling with what we still hold in our thoughts. They are in an eternal realm. For us, we sit here, and if you still struggle with it, it means it's not the end. It means that that circumstance has not been finished. So even in the middle of the desperation, God still wants to process with you. God still wants to go through these things with you and even face the difficulties. So Jesus heads back. If you've read it, you know the story. He goes back and out comes Martha. I sent word for you. I asked you to come. I know how long the journey is. What were you doing? And she brings her honest heart and says, listen, if you would have come, he wouldn't have died. That's how I know that that's her heart. She says, I know that you can do all these really cool things and stuff, but if you would have come, he wouldn't have died. Martha was not just talking about the circumstance and the difficulties of Lazarus, because you understand, it had been 3 days. When you lose somebody, it is not like, oh, they're here, oh, they're gone, that was sad, you move on. Martha and Mary were still in a state of mourning. Mary was still back in the house. She didn't even come out and meet Jesus. She was so heavy and broken. It actually says that when she does rise up to come, those who were there mourning with her came as well. This was days of grief and agony. It wasn't just Lazarus' situation. Actually, what we see here in this story was Mary and Martha's circumstance. This is who we hear it from. We don't know how Lazarus felt. We don't know if he suffered. We don't know what went on in his mindset. I mean, obviously, I'm sure he would have wanted to get better, but we're not told. We're not told his disposition towards Jesus when he was breathing his last breath. We don't know that. The story that we're looking at here is Mary and Martha's story. And they had an issue with their brother Lazarus. What's your Lazarus? What is the Lazarus in your life where you are at that place of desperation? This message is speaking to me too, because this is not just my message. I was challenged with this message over the last week. And I realized there are Lazaruses in my life where I am at a place where I don't know what to do. I'm trying. I try the things and I'm trying my best to fix circumstances or situations. And maybe for you, I mean, my mom shared today some Lazarus. Literally, it's so similar. People who are on the verge of dying. And we pray, and we ask for others to pray, and we petition, we present a request to God. And we should try and do it with thanksgiving in our heart. But the Lazarus moments for us are the ones where we're the ones who are feeling the weight of this. And like Mary and Martha, they were at an end to themselves. And Jesus asked them the question, don't you believe in the resurrection of the dead? Yes, she says, yes, in the last day they'll be raised up. I believe that. But Jesus says, it's more than just that. It's now. It's here. Do you not believe that? And we know how the story goes. Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb. And by 3 days, I mean, Jesus, at this point, he's going to stink pretty bad. He stinketh. It's one of my favorite statements in the Bible. In other words, it wasn't just like they were going to wake him up, because he had just passed out. He's going to go in and do like some fancy CPR move or something, and it's like in the old heave-ho, and he comes back. At this point, his body is rotting and decaying. It's dead. And Jesus calls him out. And out comes Lazarus walking out. With the grave clothes still on him. And he's restored. He's made new. How beautiful that Mary and Martha in that moment got to see the fruit of their prayers, petitions, hopes. We're not always that blessed to see, if you like, the end. But the question is, what is blessed? What is blessed? Sometimes we confuse these terms because now, again, I project the things that I have gone through, my life circumstances and situations, the things that I feel I am entitled to, or the things that I ought to receive, and we project them onto God. Even though they're tiny little things, we still allow all of these circumstances that have gone on in our life to be projected onto God, and that begins to define who He is. God, if I don't get to see the things that I've asked for, where's the blessing? God, if this doesn't come out the way that I'm hoping that it will, why have you forsaken me? And now our circumstances, although they may be things that we have gone through in our life where we have this sense of entitlement or a Western world view of what it means to be blessed, gets put on God and says, this doesn't make sense. This is unfair. But that doesn't mean that that's who God is. We may perceive Him through those lenses, but that doesn't mean that that's who God is. Who is God? Allow Him to define Himself, not your circumstances. Go back and look at all the things that He has spoken about Himself as He reveals Himself to us. In the middle of those situations, go ahead and ask Him who He is in those situations, and He would be happy to reveal Himself to you if you are willing to have eyes to see and ears to hear. Because sometimes it's like this. It's like, well, I'll look at it a little bit. I'm going to see a little bit, but this is offensive to me when you did that, and I don't want to see it, so I'm going to pretend like it's not there. And you know what God goes after? Right there. And He'll just stay there until we're willing to open up and see. We wonder why we get stuck in ruts and we're just staying right there. It's like God's like, I can't go on any further until you're willing to see me there. I can't take you any farther from here because when you get there, you'll have no idea what's going on. You're going to be like, well, Jesus, if He's sleeping, He'll get better. She's like, oh, man. God's desire is that we have eyes to see and ears to hear, but that we're doing it all the time. That when we feel as though we've been forsaken, we're going back and saying, help me understand. Instead of, that's not fair. We throw around terms like blessed. Oh, yes. Oh, I went out last night. We had a lovely steak dinner and sat with friends and spent all kinds. Oh, we're so blessed. Is that the mark of blessing? Or was it just nice? Because there are millions, billions of people who will never go and sit at a steak dinner and sit in the warm comforts of a place and enjoy it. Does that mean that they're not blessed? We begin to use this metric that really is kind of a Western mindset when it comes to God being a God of blessing or not blessing. Oh, I got a raise. Last week I got a raise. It was going to be a $10,000 a year raise. Oh, so blessed. Are you blessed? Or are you blessed to have been able to function the way that you function and process the way you process so that you earned a raise simply because you have the abilities that God gave you? Oh, well, maybe the abilities that God gives us are a blessing. Well, wait a minute. Because I can walk around and use my legs and my feet freely and run around, am I more blessed than somebody who's confined to a wheelchair? They'll never experience as much blessing as I experience, if that's how we use it. The way we use blessing, it's something that we use, again, and we project our concepts onto who God is. And we begin to define when God is good and when he is not good by the things that we think are blessings and not blessings. And it's a scary thing, because now we have also begun to reproduce this to other people. And suddenly, when they face a difficult circumstance in their life, when their circumstances are trying and they get to the point where they feel desperate, God gave up on me. God has forsaken me. Because now their definition of who God is by all these other things that are circumstantial. Allow God to define himself. Go to his word and see what it is that goes on in here. Because listen, this same God who brings blessing through plentiful harvests that we see in here is the same God who brings blessing through punishment and, well, not punishment. Punishment's not the right word. Correction and discipline. It's the same God. The correction and discipline is also blessing. If we want to be able to see God and hear God, then we need to make sure that we're actually looking for God as he defines himself to be, not as I want to see. So what is your Lazarus? What is it that's going on in your life right now where you feel like, I don't get it? I can't understand it. I've asked 1,000 times. Do you still believe that God loves you? As I was listening to this message this past week and was challenged to consider these thoughts, there was a verse in that passage that was highlighted, and I thought it was very unique. It said that in John 11, before it really even gets into the story of what's going on, John notes something that's very significant. And when I heard this, it really put things into perspective for me. In verse 2, I'll go back and read 1 just for context. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary, and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word. I've read that a lot of times. Every time I go through, I just was like, oh yeah, good information. Just a little bit of perspective and reference there. But as John tells this story, it was pointed out to me that that doesn't happen until chapter 12. If you go to chapter 12, you can read this situation that he's talking about. In verse 3 of chapter 12, it says, Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. They all get upset. Jesus says, leave her be. So John pulls that out of the future. Not that he was writing this years and years later. And he notes it right ahead of the story. As he introduces Mary and Martha and the brother Lazarus, he pulls that out and says, this is the same Mary that poured the perfume on Jesus' feet. And he jogs this memory of this intimate moment between Mary and Jesus, where she comes to pour out everything that she has on his feet, and in an act of humility, wipes his feet. So this happened after, but yet he notes it here. And this was the challenge that comes through that, is when we're facing these difficult circumstances, we need to remember that he loves us and that we love him. And we need to do our very best to picture ourselves in the resolve. Not to just be captivated by the moment or the circumstance now, but to picture ourselves knowing what we know about God, about his nature, about who he is, what we have seen in the past, what we have heard in the past, the things that we know and understand are true, the promises that he has revealed, the things that he has given to us to understand who it is that he says he is. We need to take those things and we need to picture ourselves in the resolve. A few weeks ago, I talked about the difference between anxiety and thankfulness. Anxiety is defined by the anticipation of a loss. Thankfulness is defined as the anticipation or realization of a gain. That's what this is about. In your circumstance or situation right now where you feel like you're not blessed, where you feel like God is not good, all of those things begin to stir and turn in our heart. We need to go back to the place where we understand who God really is. And then we need to step into that place of thanksgiving or put ourselves into, in this case, chapter 12 and see where it is that we would be with God. What is it that he's calling us to? What is he inviting us to? What is it that he can do in the middle of this circumstance right now? What is it that is coming? If I know that his nature is good, what is it that is coming? And I want to picture myself there. And then trust that God is going to do what he is going to do. And believe him all the way. And then like in Hebrews chapter 11, even if you don't see the end result, even if you're sitting in faith to the point that you die, or that somebody else dies, it doesn't change the nature of God. It doesn't mean that you were forsaken. It doesn't mean that you are not blessed. It means that you didn't understand. But God is still the one who's on the throne. And we still bow before him. Listen, I love that we are called friends of God if we obey what he has called us to. I love that we are called the brothers of Jesus. I love that he has called us his children and he's like our father. I love that. But listen, there is still a point in our relationship with God where we have to understand that we bow the knee. That we're the ones that bow the knee. He doesn't bow to our demands or our claims. We bow the knee to him because he is the creator. Because he has made everything that we know and even understand. We have nothing outside of him. So in those circumstances, when we hope and we believe for things that we cannot see, that's what's called faith, people. When we believe for those things and we don't understand it, we still sit in faith. We bow the knee in faith, trusting that God knows what he's doing. And when the circumstances don't turn out the way that we think that they should, that doesn't mean that we get to define who God is. Because God is who he is, whether we say it or think it or not. Our objective, get to know who he is. Get to know who he is. If we don't spend time with him in prayer, if we don't spend time with him in study, if we don't spend time with him in intimate places, then we won't know who he is. We won't know what voice to hear. We won't know what it is that we're looking for. That is our responsibility. So when our circumstances don't seem to match who God said he is, doubt the circumstance and believe who God is. Doubt the circumstance and believe who God is. And that's where the peace comes. When it says, in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving in your heart, right? With the anticipation of a gain in your heart, present your request to God. And that's where the peace that transcends all understanding will come. Because now it's not the circumstance that is our God. It is God. And we believe him by faith. Because we haven't seen it, but we still believe it. God, thank you that you have proven yourself time and time again. God, I have got to admit, there are things that I do not understand. And I am happy to admit them to you over and over again. But I don't want to do it in an accusatory way. God, I want you to know that I do believe in you, that I trust you. I want you to be the God of my circumstance. God, I pray that as we cry out to you with these things, these situations, these things that are in front of us right now, God, I pray that you will bring that peace. That we will be able to humble ourselves, to be able to step out of the way, and all the things that we carry through our life, that we project on you, that we would remove them, and we would actually look to see you. God, that we would be representatives of you, of your honor and your glory. And we would be willing to look to chapter 12 and have faith and walk by faith. You are the God of our circumstances. You are the God of everything. I am sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness for putting these things before you. For putting my troubles and my worries and my stresses and my anxious moments before you as idols. And giving them power that does not belong to them.
That's very impressive. Remember yelling at them.
Continue to build our faith, Father. Continue to stir our
I bet
hearts.
you he was still plugged into
We
that.
want to be people with eyes that see and ears that hear.
Yeah.
In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Can I stop? Sure, hit the
I
right
pray
button.
that you will see God's
Then
real
you gotta
blessings.
slide it to stop.
If there's anybody who does have a circumstance that they're going through,